So I have an announcement this morning. This week, Cindy and I found out that we are expectant parents. And very soon, we are going to give birth to a 42-year-old bouncing woman. She's been bouncing in the past. She'll be bouncing in the future. That's all I know. And in a certain way, this kind of plays into the message that I'm giving this morning. And because, with what we read in the gospel reading about things that God does, one of the things I think that's really interesting about what I do as a pastor, because I either get to baptize people or marry people, and I always say that what we do when we do those things, we're catching up with God. You know, God has already done the miracle in somebody's life. He's already brought two people together and made them one flesh. He's already, saved and renewed somebody and made them, a new creation in Christ. When we do the baptism, we're just catching up. We're doing what God, we're recognizing what God has already done. And so even though this seems like a brand new announcement, actually God already did it, and he did it like 4 years ago. Cindy and I were allowing Annie and the kids to stay at our house, and we were doing what we always do at our family. We're having dinner around the table, goofing around, laughing, and having fun, because that's just the way it is. And I looked across the table, and I looked at Annie, and God said, "This is your daughter." And I'm like, God, come on. Nobody adopts. At that time, she was younger, so she would have been like 38. But nobody adopts a 38-year-old woman as a daughter. I mean, that just never happened. And God says, well, but I've just made her your daughter. And I didn't argue anymore with God, but it took me a little while, not long, I mean, maybe a few weeks, a month or something like that, for me to get to the place where it's like, okay, God, I'm on board with what you're saying. What I think is really cool is that from the scripture reading where we find out that God is able to do things and he tells us what we need and he takes care of it for us, was that he spoke to Annie and told her, you just really need a set of parents. And so she came to us and said, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Now, this is the part that really plays into my message in a big way. Because remember, the title of the message, let me just put that up on the screen, is When is Truth Boasting? Okay, this is what it goes into. And so she had sent us a text saying, could you guys come over? There's something I've been thinking about and I've been wanting to talk to you about for a while. Could you come over so we talk about it? And Cindy suspected of what was going on. She already had an idea. She didn't say anything to me. She was just thinking it. And she was getting really impatient with me because I wasn't getting ready to leave as quickly as she wanted to leave. And she was getting a little bit testy. And it's like, okay, great. And she's owning it. And so when we get there and Annie says what's on her mind, and Cindy says, I knew you were going to ask this. I knew that. And I did what I typically do is I go, oh, really? I didn't even suspect nothing. It reminds me of the Maine comedian Tim Sample. He was doing radio ads when I first came to Maine in the mid-'80s. And he did this ad, and he goes, you know those people who don't even know nothing? He goes, this character don't even suspect nothing. Well, that's me. So often I don't even suspect nothing. And so that happens to be a weakness, and this idea of weakness is what we're going to be talking about in the message. But I'm boasting about the weakness because, it's the truth about who I am. It's the way things go. Oftentimes, when God is doing something in my life and he's talking to me, it's like when he first brings it up, it's like, no, you couldn't possibly mean that. And it takes me a little while before I'm 100% on board with what God is saying. So, when is truth boasting? We're going to take a look at that because that actually is tied to our key question, when is telling the truth really just a boast?
So, Brad, what did he want to ask us?
She wanted to ask us if we'd be her parents and would adopt her.
We would adopt her legally.
Legally, right. Because she wants her name to be Antoinette Taylor. She wants...
Anything but what it is.
And this is a change of...
I mean that in a good way.
Right.
It sounded good after it came out.
No, but this is a change of identity. It's a way of saying goodbye to the past, goodbye to the things that have not been good in your life, and saying hello to the good things that have been happening now. That's really what it is. And that's something that everybody in some aspect of their life needs to be able to say goodbye to something and say hello to something else. That really is what accepting Jesus as your Savior is. You're saying goodbye to the sinful nature, and you're saying hello to being a child of God and being saved and knowing that you belong to Him, that you are His child now. And so that's what salvation is all about. And Cindy and I have adopted other kids, and they were, older. I mean, they weren't infants when we adopted them, and they needed to have that moment where they said goodbye to their past, especially the oldest ones. And that was not something that they did easily. That was something that, as they started getting into adulthood, they rebelled against that, because it's like, wait a minute, I didn't even have any choice in this. I was just told, pack your bags. You're going to go, and these people are going to be your parents now. And so we went through that process of people saying, no, you're not my parents. You didn't give birth to me. You're not my parents. I'm not going to call you. And what's happened one by one with all of the kids who reacted that way is they've reached a point in their life where they have said, yes, you are my parents. You are the people who have actually loved me and cared for me and been there for me the way nobody else was willing to be. And so Annie has just, she's at that place, and she's saying the same thing. But God had already told me that she was my daughter. That was already said, even though I didn't suspect that she was going to come back and say, I want to make it legal. So I'm boasting about the fact that I didn't have a clue. That's my boast, and I can be very proud of the fact that I don't have any idea what's going on, but that's an important thing, that because I don't know what's going on, many times I depend upon God more because of that, and I listen to Him more because of that. And so my grandmother said this. I forgot I had a granny slide in here. And she used to say, it's not boasting if it's the truth. And that is actually wrong. And I'm going to get to that in the key idea in just a minute, because she used to say that. I thought it was true, and then I found out, no, it actually isn't true. Okay, the key idea, when attention and glory is a spotlight on the speaker, it's a boast, okay? It's not truth, it's a boast. When the attention and glory and the spotlight is on the Lord Jesus Christ, that is telling the truth. You are not focusing people's attention on you. You are not the center. So when you boast, in the Lord, you are actually talking about something that the Lord has done. And that was something that was hard for me to deal with, because, I've told you before about, how I did in college when I went to Bible college. But one of the things I noticed when I first graduated, and I mentioned to somebody, what my grades were and, what my position in the class was, and I always said that this is something that God did for me. It wasn't me doing it. It wasn't my accomplishment. This was God's accomplishment. This was God doing something, and this was God showing me that He was present and with me, and that His power was present and with me. It wasn't my accomplishment. It was His accomplishment. What I learned early on was that people heard the part about, oh, he's just boasting about himself. He's just bragging on himself. He's being so egotistical. And they missed the part about God. And so really, for well over a decade, I never mentioned it again, because I didn't want people to get the wrong idea. And then it's like, but by not mentioning it, I'm not giving God the glory. This was His accomplishment. And this is part of the testimony that I have, is that God was right there with me. God carried me through. And what I achieved, yes, I get the credit on a piece of paper here in the world, but I know in my heart that God is the one who got the credit. And God is the one who deserves the glory for that accomplishment. And God, that accomplishment is always a reminder to me that what I do here as a pastor, I am doing it because God empowered me to be able to do it. It's not me, it's Him. I represent Him, which is why when I first became a pastor here, some of you might remember when I declared that I was the interim pastor. And boy, did some people get nervous. What, he's not staying? We're going to have to go looking for another pastor again? We just got one. And it's like, no, you don't understand. Every pastor is an interim pastor. Every pastor serves God for a time in a place at God's pleasure. And when God decides it's time for that person to leave, then they leave. And so I will leave when God tells me that my time is done. My time will either be done when I retire, when I'm carried out of here in a pine box, or, I know that sounds extreme, but God's going to tell me when the time is up. And I may be too dense, because remember, I don't suspect nothing. He might have to take me out in a pine box because I'm not going to get it. That's just who I am. And or God could just decide He's going to send me to another church. And at my age, it's like, please, Lord, don't send me someplace else. I don't want to have to go through that process all over again. I'm too old for that. Then I read about the old people in the Bible, and it's like, okay, I guess I'll just have to sigh and shrug and go with it. But the point that I'm making here is that if you're going to boast, you boast in who God is and what God has done. And so if it ties back into your life, you're not saying, oh, look at me, I'm so wonderful, I did this, I did that, I tried extra hard and it paid off and I can strut my stuff. It's like, no, God actually did this. That's why, in recent years, I've said about my grades, I said, if you saw my transcripts from when I was fresh out of high school and went to college, and you would have said, well, that guy doesn't have two brain cells to rub together. He's not too smart, And as a matter of fact, the dean who admitted me transferred in a lot of credits. The dean who took her place looked at my transcript and thought, what was this woman doing? She should not have let this guy into this school and transferred in as many credits as she did. He just doesn't have what it takes, And he was suspicious of me until finally I had been consistently getting decent grades. And he's like, I don't understand this. He finally confessed to me, I don't understand this. I looked at your transcripts. You should not be getting these kind of grades. I go, well, I haven't seen my transcripts. Can I take a look at them? He goes, sure. He brought them out. I made photocopies of them. And I go, I can see your point. I said, I didn't realize I did this poorly. I didn't realize I was this dumb when I was younger, And so I can understand why you would say that. But the difference is A, I'm older and more mature, so I go about my studies differently now. And B, I came into this and having no confidence in myself whatsoever, but I did have confidence in the Lord. And the Lord said He was going to be with me, so I have confidence in Him. So what you're seeing is the work of God. It's not the work of bread. You just need to understand that. And, He treated me like, I was a better student after that. But He understood my heart in the middle of it. I wasn't boasting about me. I was boasting about the Lord. And that's the truth. So if we're going to tell the truth, we're going to tell the truth about who God is and what God has done and how we have benefited from what God has done. And that's the type of boasting that we want to talk about. And when we look at this passage, Paul is going to be spending a lot of time talking about boasting in this. It almost seems like that's the main point of the passage because he spends so much time talking about it. But I think it's really important because one of the things we should be doing as Christians is we should be giving testimony about who God is and what God has done in our life. In order to do that, we need to have it really clear in our minds that our accomplishments are from God. And we need to be clear in our minds how God has been there for us and the difference that God has made. We need to spend time thinking about this. We need to spend time praying about this. We need to be asking God, how can I talk about you? How can I talk about your presence and power in my life so that somebody else can see that I'm not just a bragging, egotistical idiot, but I am somebody who is completely dependent upon you, and I give you the glory for everything. How can I do that in such a way that people look at that and they go, wow, I would like to have that kind of a relationship with God. I would really like to have God in my life making these things happen for me. Am I missing something? We want people to have that kind of a reaction. But if we just keep sitting on our hands and keep our mouths shut or be slack-jawed and, look like that and never say anything and never think anything, then we're never going to be able to give testimony. And it's really the testimony about who God is and what he has done in your life which actually screams the loudest gospel message to people. Most people think, I've got to take a class and I've got to learn to memorize the scripture and I need to, deliver it this way or that way. And you know what? If you're just talking about who God is and what he has done for you, that's going to be the gospel message to the person you're talking to. And the more they hear each one of us doing this, the more powerful the message becomes, because it's now not just one person saying it. It's 2, 3, 4, 5, 20, 30. It's lots of people saying it. And when people are hearing it over and over again from lots of different people, they start to go, maybe there's some truth in this. Maybe there's something that I just shrugged off and thought wasn't important and didn't care about. Maybe I need to pay attention to this a little bit more. Maybe I need to find out more about this. So the problem, and it's the problem I mentioned about people with me when I first graduated, is that many people only half listen. They miss the point. And so just because people half listen, God pointed out to me, it's like, well, it's not your fault that they half listen. You can be more intentional in explaining things to people so they realize who you're giving the glory to, and they're not seeing it's you just bragging on yourself, that they see it's you pointing them to me. So just because people half listen, it just means that we have to be much more careful and much more intentional about how we talk. And if you have a day where you say something and you go, well, I realize I said that in a really clunky way. I realize I wasn't clear about that at all and I left the wrong impression. Think it through and figure out how will you talk about it the next time that you talk about it so that you can be better at doing this. Our sermon passage is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 10 on page 822 of the Pew Bible. And we start off in verse 1, and right away, Paul says, this boasting will do no good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations from the Lord. So boasting, which is defined as an expression of pride, boasting is about taking glory. It's about being the center of attention and having all the attention drawn on you. That's what boasting is. And so Paul is struggling with this idea because he knows what he's talking about sounds like boasting. But he says, I'm going to tell about visions and revelations from the Lord. That's really key. He's not saying that this is me being just a grand, wonderful guy, who's so clever and so smart that I know stuff that nobody else can know, and I've figured out these secrets of life that nobody else can possibly know. He's not saying that. He's saying that these visions and these revelations, this stuff, these are things that no person has access to. No person could possibly ever understand in and of themselves. The only way you ever have access to this kind of information is because God chooses to make it available to you. So what he's going to boast about, he's going to boast about what God is doing. He's not going to be boasting about what he is doing. In other words, he wants to give the glory to God, and he wants God to be at the center of what he's talking about. So this boasting isn't for himself, it's for God. And that's a key thing when we think about boasting. We think about, am I drawing attention to myself, or am I focusing all attention on God? Am I shining a spotlight on the glory of God, or am I shining it on me? If it's shining on you, that's where it becomes a bad thing. Verse 2 in the beginning of 3. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside of my body. So that I look at the I don't know, and based on everything I've said to you so far, I identify with that, because Paul is saying, I don't even suspect nothing here. I have no idea what's really going on. God did it. I mean, I know what I experienced, but I don't really completely understand every aspect of what I experienced. I can't tell you everything that happened and the way it happened, because this was something that God was doing. It wasn't me doing it, and therefore I don't know what it is. And I identify with that so fully, because there are times when I've had experiences with God, and I look at those experiences and I think, wow, how do I explain this to somebody else? The first time God gave me a vision and I tried to explain the vision, I go, wow, this is really hard to explain. It's like, well, it's sort of like this, but no, it's really sort of more like that. That happens in the Bible, where other people have had this experience where they went and say, well, it was sort of like this. It's not really this, but how do I explain something that came from God that isn't part of our natural world that everybody experiences all the time? So when Paul says this, it's like, I get it. I know exactly. I've been there. I've experienced that myself. So I read what Paul says, and it makes perfectly logical sense to me. I can identify with it completely. Going on in verse 3 into verse 4. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. So, in other words, he's had these experiences, he has this knowledge, and he can't even express it to somebody else. It's like, I can tell you I've been through this, but the problem with going through this is that there are no words to express it. And besides, he's saying here that God has put him in a certain measure of amnesia, if you will, or confusion, so that he knows the experience is real. He knows that God was in the middle of it. He knows that it was a gift from God that he received. He knows that much. And he knows that God was present in his life at that moment in a very special way. He knows this. And yet he also realizes that this is not something that he can give a clear, specific testimony about. This is really beyond a normal human experience. And that's what he's trying to convey. And that would be a very normal way to have one of these kind of experiences with God. So what Paul is going through is a normal spiritual experience. Verse 5. That experience is worth boasting about. But I'm not going to do it. I will boast only about my weaknesses. Because he could boast and say, well, God picked me, and he could be, puffing his chest out and strutting his stuff and say, oh yeah, I'm such a spiritual guy that God picked me, Paul, and he took me here, and he did this, and he did this, and I got to do it, and you didn't. That would be boasting. He's saying that's not what I'm doing. What he's doing is he's saying that God is present in his life. God is there and doing things, and he's aware of that. And when he says, I will boast only about my weaknesses, he's going, I couldn't have done any of this stuff on my own. I don't have the brains. I don't have the strength. I don't have the cleverness. Whatever somebody thinks that they need to have to be able to do this, I don't have any of this stuff. You're just looking at a very weak human being. That I can boast about. Just like I said that when we went to Annie's house and Cindy was like, I knew you were going to do this. And I'm going, really? I didn't even suspect nothing. It wasn't even on my mind. Okay, I can boast about being weak like that. I can boast about that because that's who I really am. If you wanted a pastor who was a genius and on top of everything all the time, that's not me. You can be sadly disappointed. If you want somebody who knows that about himself and says, and therefore I have to trust in God and I have to listen to him and I have to obey him, if that's what you're looking for, I can give you that much. And that's what Paul is describing here. He's describing, I'm just a guy who doesn't know much. And back when he thought he knew something, Do you remember what Paul was doing back when he thought he knew something? He was persecuting Christians and having them get killed. He was doing everything he could to destroy the church, and he thought that what he was doing was exactly the right thing. He thought that his doctrine was completely correct, and nobody was going to tell him it wasn't, until God blinded him on the road to Damascus. And that's when he found out that he didn't know as much as he thought he knew. He wasn't as correct as he thought he was. That was when he came to a place of pure humility where he recognized, God knows more than I know. Maybe I need to start listening to and paying attention to God. So, yeah, I'll boast about my weaknesses. I'll boast about my weaknesses because every time I don't know something, every time I don't understand something, every time I can't do something, God can be there for me. And if it's what God wants me to do, God will help me to make it happen the way he wants to have it happen. That's the reason why he's willing to boast about his weaknesses, because he doesn't live alone. He lives by the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit. Beginning of verse 6. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I would be telling the truth. Okay? So, telling the truth, that comes back to the point. But he's telling the truth because the truth points everybody to God. And so the truth is about weakness. And the nice thing about saying that I'm not too bright and that I don't know things and that I don't suspect nothing is, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands so you can just like go, whew. But I suspect that there are people sitting in this room right now who are going, I'm the same way. I don't suspect nothing. I usually can't figure things out. I struggle. I'm weak. The point is that when we're honest about that aspect of who we are, that puts us on common ground with all the other people who know that truth about themselves, but haven't been willing to talk about it because they figure they're the only one and they don't want to look stupid in front of everybody else. But when you finally say, hey, guess what? I'm stupid and I don't care if anybody knows it, they go, whew, you know, I can be comfortable with this person because they're honest about who they are. And they're not bragging, and they're not standing above me, and they're not looking down their nose at me, and they're not acting like they're something that they're really not. They're not putting on a false piety. They're just being real people. So Paul can do that because it's the truth. The rest of 6 and the beginning of 7. But I won't do it because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. So his life and his message are the key things that he cares about. He realizes that through his life, people can see the presence of God. And when he gives the message of the gospel, and they're seeing that in the context of the life that he is living, they know that this is a true message. It's not something that he made up. He's not just trying to manipulate and control people or anything, that's evil like that. That's not what he's doing. He's telling them the truth, and he's letting them know that they can be in a place with God where they can have the same kind of strength and the same kind of joy that he has found. So he really cares about what people see in his life. And he really cares whether people actually hear the message. He wants them to look at how he's living so that their mind and their heart and their ears are open to the message that God has sent him to deliver. That's what he cares about. And that's what we should all be caring about. The rest of 7. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. So this thorn is actually a reminder of weakness. It's a reminder of his need for God. And we don't know exactly what it is, but chances are it's some sort of a temptation issue. It's something that would tempt him to do something that he probably shouldn't do. And so this thorn is bringing him to a place where he's always reminded, I need God. I should not depend on myself. And so that is important. And therefore, because he's willing to admit this, that should be something that you and I should be willing to admit. We should be willing, and some people think, oh, if I have to admit it, does that mean I have to give people every single embarrassing, dirty detail? No. It means that you don't try to project an air of, I knew that, I had it all under control, I did it well. It's like you can say, well, I knew this part of it, but I didn't know that part. I knew a little bit, but I didn't know it all. You know, this was an experience where I actually was learning something. This was an experience where I actually had to depend on, help that God sent me through somebody else. This is something where I recognize that I am weak. If we can confess that about ourselves, and not just confess it in words, but actually practice it. That one of the hardest things that people do is accept the kindness of strangers. I said it that way because most people call it, I don't need your charity. I don't want your charity. Because they see charity as being something pathetic. That's why I refer to it as the kindness of somebody else. People come along and they see a need, and out of the love in their heart, they will want to meet that need. Sometimes it's God prompting them and saying, I've equipped you for that. You can actually help this person right now. And so I'd like you to go do that. And so they're actually trying to be obedient to God. This idea of having a need is not just that you admit that you have needs, but when you have needs and somebody comes along and says, I can help you with this, you graciously accept the help. You accept it because A, you know you need it. B, you know God is sending it to you. And C, you know that God is going to bring a blessing to the person that he has sent to help you. See, it's amazing how all of this stuff all works together. And we live in a much better world as Christians when we can live in this particular way. Verse 8, 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. He said, I just want freedom from my difficulty. I've been in that place. I know some of you have been in that place because you've told me. I'm pretty sure others of you have been in that place and you haven't been willing to confess it yet. But the point is that we have all had this experience where there was something going on in our life, either something that we had a personal weakness for that we couldn't overcome, or something that was happening around us or being done to us, and we're asking God to give us relief from the difficulty. We've had these experiences, and we beg God to take it away. And sometimes God does, and sometimes God doesn't. And what Paul found out in the beginning of 9, each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. In other words, sometimes, and people have a struggle with this, it's like, I asked God to take this away and he didn't take it away. God must hate me. God doesn't care about me. Look at this. My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. What God is saying is, I want to show you my love. I want to show you my forgiveness. I want to show you my power. I want to show you my glory. And I want you to experience it firsthand. And I want others to see it happening in your life. Paul is saying that this was a lesson that was a challenge. Because remember, he begged 3 times. And what Paul is really admitting here is that this was not an easy lesson for him to learn. And I bet it's not an easy lesson for any of us to learn. So if Paul could have been through the struggle and come to this place, then if you are going through this kind of a struggle now, you can get to the place where Paul is at. This is, a little bit of sunshine that's going to break through the clouds for you on this. Going on in verse 9. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. Okay? So what is he saying when he says, I'm glad to boast? What he's really saying is, I am glad to testify about God. Because he's turned it from, look at me, I'm so wonderful. Now he's taken the word boast and he's put it in this context where he's saying, he goes, I want to testify. I want people to know the truth about me so that they will then see the power of Christ working in me. And when they see that, they will come to realize that just as God can show me his love by giving me his power and making a difference in my life, he can do that for them as well. That's why this is so important. This is how your life becomes a living testimony where people can see it. And you shouldn't be afraid to admit the truth and to talk about what God is doing in your life. Verse 10, that's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He looks at his weaknesses and he says, when I'm weak, guess who's with me? Guess who's showing me his love? Guess who's coming right alongside? Guess who is empowering me to do that which I cannot do for myself? Guess who is encouraging me and lifting me up when I want to throw my hands in the air and just completely give up and not bother anymore? That's what he's saying, that when I am weak, when I feel this way, when I just want to throw in the towel and not bother anymore, God comes alongside and he holds me up and he encourages me and he reminds me, I am not alone. God is with me. And God just isn't with me. It's God's power that's with me. And when God's power is with me, then clearly God's love is with me. And that is cool, and that makes all of the difference. So what's our truth nugget here? Boasting about God is giving truthful testimony. So we've just changed the world's definition of boasting and the world's practice of boasting through this message, and we've turned it around to saying, okay, you want to boast about God? You want to give truthful testimony about who God is and what he has done in your life? Is that what you want to do? Because that's what testimony is. And in just a minute, anybody who wants to do some boasting is going to have a chance to do some boasting. The way I've taught it today, that's the kind of boasting that we're talking about here. And so the takeaway is God is glorified when I express need and give testimony. You realize that? God is glorified. Do you ever stop to think about how God is glorified when you talk about how you're weak, what your need is, and when you confess that, when you don't try to pretend that you've got your act together? Have you ever stopped that when you're being honest about that God can be glorified? Because at that point you're saying, I can't do this on my own. I depend upon God. God is the one who gets me through. God has got me through in the past. God's going to get me through right now. And in the future, God is going to get me through. That's just the way it is. I give testimony to God. My life is not just a life that's going by. My life is a living testimony to the love, the power, and the glory of God.